Yesterday, my wife and I took a little trip down to Taos, New Mexico. And if you looked at last night's video, you can see some of the ironwork that we took a look at while we were down there. But on the way, we stopped at a little restaurant for breakfast, and there were some veterans there. And in honor of Memorial Day, they were handing out these little poppies. The poppy has for a long time been a symbol used as a remembrance and a way to honor those who sacrificed their lives in war. With this being Memorial Day weekend here in the U.S., I think you might go by different names and have different practices in other parts of the world. But I know that a lot of places still use the poppy as a symbol, so I thought it would be a good time for us to make a poppy. Now, the poppy that I have here is based on some that were done as a project in 2016 and several years leading up to that. It actually was put in place in 2016. And it's the Ypres, I believe it's pronounced Y-P-R-E-S, and it's in Belgium, and they forged 2016 poppies that are larger than this one. This is based on theirs, but it's not as big as theirs, for this project that will be a permanent memorial. So I thought we would take a look at forging a poppy. It will not be exactly like the Ypres memorial, so I encourage you to go watch some videos about their project, and I will provide some links both up here in the corner as the video goes on to some of what I found on their original plans to forge these when they were enlisting the help of blacksmiths from around the world to forge the poppies for this memorial. But I'll also link in the description to a website where you can find a PDF or a DXF file for the poppy blank. So if you want to make one exactly like theirs, that will be there. Now today I'm using their pattern, but I'm not worried about scale. I went ahead and printed this out. My printer did not print these to scale. This particular drawing is in millimeters, and it specifies 155 millimeters, which is roughly 6 1/4 inches. And when I measure what my printer printed, I get 4 1/4, so I'm about 2 inches shy. But that's okay. It's still in keeping with that project, and it's in keeping with honoring those who've lost their lives in wars and remembering them. And the exact size of the poppy doesn't matter because this isn't going to be part of that project. This one will go in my garden or out in front of the greenhouse or something like that, and I think you can make this any size you want. So I have this printout, and that's a good way to start with a project like this, is a paper pattern. And you could do this by hand if you wanted to, but the paper pattern does make your life a little easier. And I have some 3/8 round bar that we will forge the stem out of. So the first thing we need to do is transfer the paper pattern to a piece of sheet metal. And I'm using 1/8 inch thick sheet metal, which is fairly heavy for a flower, but there's going to be some peening out and spreading to get the texture and the shape of the flower just right. So you need to start with a significant amount of material. 1/8 inch is probably ideal. Now, how do we transfer our paper pattern to sheet metal? It's really quite simple. We're going to cut it roughly out. Doesn't need to be exact by any means. Just enough to get rid of all the excess paper. Now you can cut this out exact and trace around it, but I think there's an easier way to do this. And that is a little bit of contact cement. Just put a little bit of this on the piece of sheet metal, enough to get the entire pattern glued down, and a little on the back of the paper. Most contact cement, and probably all contact cement, requires that it sit for a little while and get tacky. So 5 or 10 minutes. Of course, it's so hot today it might only be 2 or 3 minutes. So once that gets tacky, we can stick it down to our sheet metal. Now we have a paper pattern, and we just cut it out right to the line, right on the sheet metal. Perhaps the simplest in concept way to do this is with a cold chisel. Now, this is going to take some time. It's 1/8" material. You're going to need to go around this 2 or 3 times with light passes. And we've talked about chiseling sheet metal out before. This is very historically correct. It can be very accurate. And in some pieces, it can really enhance the finished piece because you get the bevel from the chisel. But this is going to take about a half hour to cut out this blank. And I don't think you want to watch me do this. So what are some other options for cutting out this blank? Now if you have a Beverly shear, you can do some of this with a shear, and it will do curves up to a point, but it's probably not the most accurate. It's going to have a real hard time getting down into the lobes of the petals here. A hacksaw makes fairly short work of it, but boy is it loud. But that's actually quite fast to do it that way. Cutting it out on a bandsaw is perhaps one of the easiest ways to go, and this little portaband is a great way to do that. Regardless of how you cut the pattern out, it will almost certainly need some sort of cleanup. So that means filing. Now this would be an ideal place for the filing vise we just did in a few recent videos, so that you can actually look and see what you're doing and you don't have to bend down quite so far. Because now I can see my line, which is also a good point, is stay proud of the line when you cut so you can file right to the line. And if you need a bevel on this, this makes it great for bevel, but this does not require one. And of course you can use a grinder here if you need to. So that gives us a petal blank. There's a little spot in the middle that needs a center punch mark where we'll either punch or drill a 1/4" hole for the stem. I'll probably go ahead and just drill that. That way it's just done before we ever go to the anvil the first time. But once you have one blank, it's not a bad idea to put that back on your piece of sheet metal if you have enough left and trace around the blank. This way you don't have to print out a whole bunch of paper to create the blanks. And what I would do is take this first one with its hole in the middle and I'd hang it on the wall. And I would keep that for a pattern in case you want to make more of these. And that way you get the most accurate one is one you made off the paper, so it's better to use it as a pattern, and then the rest of them will be based off that. If you use this one to create a next one and use it as a pattern and so on, it's like Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy. Pretty soon they don't look very good. I should have mentioned when we were chiseling and showing that you can cold chisel these. It's a very valid technique. That's very easily done under the treadle hammer. It's faster, it's more accurate. Make sure you have a positive stop so you don't squish your fingers because you're holding that little chisel under the treadle hammer and you don't want to smash your hand. But with a stop on the treadle hammer, you can sit in a stool. It really goes quite quickly, and a half an hour to cut one of these isn't that bad. That sounds ineffective when you have a little bandsaw or a shear or some other means of cutting this. Maybe you've got a plasma cutter. But if you don't have those things, the time to chisel costs you much less than going out and buying new tools that you may not really need. You can hand cut with a chisel a lot of these and pay yourself that hourly wage, even if it's 20 bucks worth of your time to cut this out. How many of these do you have to cut before you justify the expense of a little bandsaw or a plasma cutter or some other means of cutting it? So it really is a very practical way to cut things out. But if you own other tools, by all means, make use of them. There's no reason not to. You're just creating a blank, and the finished product will not show any sign whatsoever of how the blank was created. So this is a good place to use more efficient means if you have those at your disposal. If you go back to that website that I'm going to link to, where they actually were trying to enlist blacksmiths from around the world to make poppies for that 2016 project, they have a DXF file, and DXF is the file format most CNC machinery takes. So if you send that to your local water jet or laser jet company, that's the file their machine will use, and they can give you a price on what it would cost to cut these. You're not going to like the price to cut one or two, but if you have some reason you want to make 20 or 30 of these, you might find it worth paying their price to do it. I don't know what it would cost, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're $5 or $6 a piece to have them cut. Now when we go to the forge, what we're going to be doing is spreading these petals out and giving them some texture and some life. When we do that, some of them are going to start to kind of overlap each other at the bases. And you'll see this if you watch the other videos from the IPRIS people, and they will explain how this is done, and I will explain it myself here. But if you start in the middle, it spreads out, and by the time you get to this edge, it might be tucked under this lobe of or this petal of the flower. So if you start here and peen this out and work to the middle, and then go to this edge and work towards the middle, you can get these edges before they get in the way of something else. And we're going to work this with a cross peen from one edge in, but the cross peen isn't big enough, so we're going to have to do some blows back and forth this way and work in and out, but not right up to the edge. Then after we've done all this, we'll do the same thing at the edge, and that helps give this rippled effect that you get along the edge, and that's part of what gives the flower its life and its organic look. And that'll look more clear when we get to the anvil. So let's go heat this up. We just throw it in the fire with the paper on it because it burns right off. So we'll start at the edge. We'll take the hottest petal here, and we're going to work the hammer in and out and work towards the middle. We'll start at the far edge and work the hammer in and out this way. But we're not worried about the very end. We just want to get the petal spread. I think that can be a little bit more, so I'm going to do it again. And you can go until it's a little bit on the cool side, but don't go too far, you might crack it. Now we'll go to the edge and do the exact same thing. And that causes the edge to kind of pucker up a little bit. If you work close to the edge of the anvil, you won't be banging the corner of your peen into the face of your anvil. On this first one, we're not worried too much about it tucking under, but as we do these others, it'll start to be a bigger issue. So start at the edge, work from the center out and back and forth. Start this edge towards the center, and what I mean the center here, back and forth. look at what's happening with this. Well, you do that. I started to get this to flare out too much there. It wasn't even, so I came in a little bit and picked up the part that hadn't moved very well. And it pays to just watch and then look at the edge and make sure it's a fairly even thickness. That's really about it for peening out the petals. Really goes fairly quickly. But this now needs to be dished a little bit. The petals should lean forward some, and it should be kind of hollow in the bottom. So let's go to a couple options for that. The ball swedge at the anvil is just ideal for this. But if you don't have one of those, now if your hardy hole is as worn out and rounded over as mine is, you can do some of this there. You may want to lean the petals back out just a little bit. Mine are cupping in further than I think they need to. Of course, a swedge block with a depression in it is a perfect place to do this. And so is a stump. The stump might also have some good spots to kind of add a little bit more texture to the petals if they didn't buckle up quite as much as you want. And I'll show you another way we can do that. These ended up a little flatter than I would like, so I want to put a little bit more wavy in the edges. This is another great place for a swedge block and a little teeny cross peen hammer. I just kind of work from both sides, a little here, a little there, and just get it the way you want it to look. Don't get too carried away. You can make them look a little bit ridiculously wrinkled. I just want to add just a little bit of something to it there, though. And I think that looks a lot better. Now we can set this aside and let it cool. Now if the flower portion is the fun part, the stem section is where the work begins. This is starting off in this case as a 3/8 round bar that is drawn out into a 1/4 inch round bar because we need that big head. You could try upsetting a 1/4 inch bar to get a 3/8 plus head, but I think that's actually more work than drawing it out. 1/4 inch doesn't like to upset very evenly. In the case of the original project where I'm getting my inspiration for this that made much bigger flowers, they started with a piece of 5/8 round bar. But of course they did most of those stems under a power hammer, but it would be a lot of work. You could certainly do that. You can do it all at the anvil. It is possible, and that's what we're going to do with the 3/8 bar. But for 5/8, that's more work than I want to do today. So I'm glad we're making slightly smaller flowers. This is some place we can use the horn of the anvil to great advantage. And even though we're going for round, we're going to start off forging to square and get about a 1/4 inch square bar. I'm turning a 1/4 turn between every blow to keep it even. I don't know if you can see that, but in the section I'm working, it's actually heating up under the hammer. If you work briskly enough, that'll happen. But overall, I'm still losing heat, so let's get it hot again. Try and even it up if it gets off. It gets crooked, so straighten it up between heats. So we're getting there. This will draw out just a little bit more as we go octagon and round, but not a lot more. My first one, I ended up with 13 inches of stem, which just happens to be the length from the step to the edge of the hardy hole. So I'm still way short of that. So we'll just keep going. Really, I don't mind if you fast forward through this part. I think we're at the point we're going to start rounding this up. It needs to be about 2 inches longer, and that might happen as we go octagon to round. But before we do that, I want to smooth out all the lumps and the bumps and make it as even a square as I reasonably can. It's a flower stem. It can be a little organic. It doesn't have to be perfect. It'll be easier to round up the better it is. So now we're at square. Let's take that to octagon. And we just knock the corners down so we have as near an octagon as we can. Again, the better job you do, the easier it is to round up in the long run. Now that this is a lot skinnier, it cools off a lot faster. So once you've got the corners knocked down to an octagon, we just lightly hammer and round up. And this does need to be pretty round. It's okay if it has texture to it, but we're going to have to pass it through a round hole in that petal. You could do this with a spring swedge, top and bottom, and doing it under the power hammer and a spring swedge would be a piece of cake. Now because that needs to go into a round hole, let's compare it with a round hole on my heading plate that's 1/4 inch. And so far we're looking good right up as far as I've rounded it. I'm going to switch to a little bit lighter hammer. This is finesse work, and you don't need that big hammer. Also try to keep it fairly straight at this stage of the game. If you'd like a bendy stem later, You can do it after the flower is assembled. We're getting pretty close there, just this last little bit. And we want a clean shoulder up here at the top. So as you round it up, make sure you leave it right at the edge of the anvil and bring the hammer blows right to the edge of the anvil so you get as clean a shoulder as you are capable of forging. You could butcher in initially, but I wasn't sure how much material I was going to need. That's pretty much all we need to do to create a stem. Now we have to work on what will become the seed head or stamen part of the flower. Make sure it's going to fit. Yep, goes right up to the end. That's just fine. So let's get it hot and cut it off. I'm going to leave about 3/4 of an inch from where the shoulder was or is. And I'm going to cut it off equally all the way around, so I end up with kind of a high point in the middle that'll be easier to work back in later. I don't want to launch that across the room, so I'll break it off. And then that is what will become our little seed head. So here's what we're going on from our previous piece, the sample I did. And it's going to be upset at the end, so it kind of mushrooms over a little bit. And then we're going to put some lines in it to represent the seed portion of it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drop that bar, the stem, down in this heading plate. And we're going to upset that a little bit and create a nice square shoulder on the bottom and upset the top some. We want the top to mushroom, but we don't want it to buckle and bow and everything. So if you need a few heats and you need to take the time to straighten this out between heats, go ahead and do that, or get it hot and then straighten it out. I don't want to crack it right there at the shoulder either. I just want to kind of clean up where it's gone a little bit off. And of course, as with everything else that I've mentioned, it's a flower and it doesn't have to be perfect. Even with a glove on, it's getting kind of hot. So again, just kind of straighten it up and get it back looking good. But you can see that is not perfectly centered, which is too bad, but it also doesn't matter. It's a flower. It can be a little organic. Now if you watch the videos that I've provided links to, you can see where they've got a nice little swedge that puts all that right in line. But for making 2 or 3 of these, I didn't think I needed to build those tools. So now we need to put our little chisel marks in. Let's do that at the vise. I'm going to start just by doing quadrants, and then I'll divide those a few more times. And while this goes a lot easier hot, it's not so bad once it starts to cool off. You may just have to be a little more aggressive with your hammer blows. That's really all that needs to happen here. As he keeps messing with it anyways. So that's the stamen part. So this simply inserts through the hole in the flower. And that kind of gives you an idea what it's going to look like. But it's got to be attached somehow. And that's one problem with this approach, is it doesn't lend itself to a very good forged attachment. So I'm afraid the best way to do this is with a little weld right back here. And for me, it's going to be a torch weld because it's fairly quick and easy. I don't have to run the generator welder to make a torch weld. TIG welding it, if you're real careful, you could probably MIG weld it. You could probably even braze it. In preparation for welding, I went ahead and did a little bit of grinding just to clean that up and give me a nice clean surface to weld to. And that's too loose to stand up this way, so it'll have to be supported up here. And to do that, I'll lock it in the vise and just let the petal hang on the stamen. So here you can see how I have this set up so it'll stay put, at least until I get a good tack weld on it. Then I can move it to where it's easier to work on. It's really quite pretty as it glows red in there. But you can see what I've done. It's not a bad weld. One more little thing though that we need to do to this. I'm going to heat it up right in here. As long as it's hot and we've got a torch ready, that's the perfect time to do this. And we're going to bend that over, not quite 90 degrees, so it kind of points up towards the sun. Now we're going to give it a little wire brushing. And that gets down inside the cracks and the crevices a little better. Those of you who just saw my new tumbler, this is not something I would put in the tumbler. If I wanted to make sure this was 100% rust-free, this is something that the soak in an acid bath might be the way to go. Very weak acid. Vinegar would work. But I don't think it's all that necessary for what I'm going to end up doing with these. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to bring this up just to a very dull glow. And as it cools down a little bit, I can do just a little bit more wire brushing. But once it gets down to a black heat, you don't want to do this at a glow. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to use a brass bristled wire brush. And you get the all brass ones. Don't use the brass plated steel because they don't really work. And I'm just going to rub. This one's about had it. The bristles are all wore off. I'm just going to brass brush the petals, and it will give kind of a bronze patina to the metal, which can be very pleasing. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can see that pretty good in the camera. That's a nice little trick for a simple finish. Try not to get too carried away and do this to everything you make. It starts to get kind of redundant if you do it to all your projects. It's my usual finish of Johnson's paste wax. And you can see how that smokes. That's just about right. You don't want just loads of smoke because then you're just burning the wax off. And it probably is better to not do this on your anvil. Your anvil gets waxy and stuff falls off of it. And then it smokes and stinks when you start forging your next project. And no, I am not sponsored by the Johnson's Paste Wax people. But if they're watching and would like to sponsor me, I would be happy to work something out for them. Then before it's completely cool, wipe the excess wax off so you don't have blobs and drips and stuff like that. When it's 100% cool, with a soft brush like a shoe brush, you can actually kind of polish this up a little bit. But now we will let that cool. While our poppy cools, I want to explore another concept for the stem. I know drawing out that much bar is a bit of effort. It really didn't take as long as I thought it might, but I was swinging a 3.5 pound hammer and it gets pretty tiring pretty fast, and if you're not used to that, I don't recommend you try it. I would stick to a smaller hammer and just plan to take a little more time. If you can forge weld, you can take a piece of 1/4 inch bar and forge weld a collar to it. And that's a very legitimate way to add some mass. 1/4 inch bar is easy to burn through while you're forge welding, so you might have a little bit of trouble. I took a piece of 1/2 inch round bar and drilled a hole through it that is a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to go take the torch, and I'll just go do that. You don't need to watch me torch weld anymore. And I'm going to weld this little piece of 1/2 inch round bar to the end and forge it, and then I'll bring it back and we'll see if it looks kind of like the stem. The only thing I won't like about it is 1/4 inch round bar looks just like 1/4 inch round bar and not a flower stem. So I would still come back and at least texture this up some, even if you don't need to draw it out and forge it to size. So I've driven the 1/4 inch round bar. Pardon the dirty shirt, I got hot wax spilled on it while I was waxing the first poppy, because that stuff is really gooey on a hot day. Anyways, I've got the bar sticking out. I'll weld a little bit around the outside, and then I'll treat it just like I did the other one. Well, there's our quickie stem with the welded on piece of tube. And it didn't come out half bad. I think it's a completely valid approach if you don't have the desire to draw that out. Since we're already welding the flower onto the stem, I think this is okay. Forge welding that on would be an option. So regardless of the way you want to do the stem, whether you draw it out or whether you build it up out of pieces, I think there's ways that you can achieve this, whatever works best in your shop. But I now have 3 poppies, and I have an extra stem, and I have an extra piece of sheet metal with a traced poppy, so I suppose I'm going to make a 3rd one. I'm not sure what I'll do with these. They might go in a garden bed, they might display in the shop here, but we'll find something nice to do with them. You get a close-up of them anyways. You can see these are a little bit different. This is the one I did first, and the flower was dished just a little bit more on it than it was on this one. So there's some variation, and it's okay. Their flowers are all going to be different. I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's an appropriate project for the Memorial Day weekend. The poppy is a good bit of symbolism, and it's worthy of our attention, and it's worth remembering. Remember that Memorial Day weekend is not about hot dogs, hamburgers, and baseball in the park. It's about remembering and honoring those who came before and sacrificed so that we can have hot dogs, hamburgers, and play baseball in the park. So I hope you take a minute to give it a little bit of thanks and a moment of silence for those folks, and maybe then get out to the shop and make a poppy. Not a bad project. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you have a good, safe Memorial Day weekend, whether you're in the shop or whether you're with family. But do stay safe either way, and do wear your safety glasses if you're in the shop. And we will see you for the next one.